following podcast is for informational purposes only. The contents of this podcast do not constitute tax, legal, or investment advice. Take responsibility for your own decisions, consult with the proper professionals, and do your own research.
Short and sweet, I think the graph is going to be indexing the world. The graph everywhere.
GRTIQ podcast.
We're like astronauts floating in the space of time.
Welcome to the GRTIQ podcast. Today I'm speaking with Joseph Al-Shami, project manager with Figment. In addition to being one of the largest indexers at the Graph and one of the world's largest blockchain infrastructure companies, the Graph recently announced on July 29th that Figment will be a core developer working at the Graph. This partnership is similar to the one previously announced by the Graph and Streaming Fast. And similar to having Marc-Antoine Ross on the podcast to explain the partnership, Joseph is joining me from Figment to answer questions about who Figment is and what this partnership means. And as you will hear, the new partnership with Figment will bring some new and exciting capabilities to the Graph community and ecosystem. Our conversation began with the discussion of Joseph's background, including how he made his way from physics, aeronautics, and mathematics to crypto.
So a couple of years back, I was studying physics at the University of Montreal. I was good at it and I really loved it. And you could say that my head was always in the sky, never here on Earth. And that kind of isolated me from my social life. I could really see a clear path for my entire life and I didn't like it much. I wanted to have more randomness in my life. So I quit physics and I went to Polytechnique of Montreal. There I started studying aeronautical engineering. And then one day, a professor gave me a D for a math course because I solved the problems from a different approach that he had taught us. And that's how I left it. And I knew that it wasn't the place for me. And then I was asking myself what I'm going to be doing. And the answer was clear. I went back to University of Montreal and studied mathematics because I really love it and I'm good at it. And there I specialized in actuarial science, which is applied mathematics in the world of finance and risk and insurance. And suddenly I am in the crypto world as I plan to be somewhere where I didn't plan to be.
Can you take us back to when you first became aware of crypto and why you decided to get involved with it?
Back at school, I had my friend Nader that always participated in competitions and used to always invite me to go to these competitions with him, but I never did. And then one day he talked to me about the fintech competition happening here in Montreal, and it is the biggest fintech competition all of Canada. And I accepted and I went to this competition. And there was many challenges and everyone was going away from the blockchain crypto challenge. And that naturally drew me towards it. So I chose this challenge and we were a group of 4 students against groups formed by professionals. We won. It was a sweet victory. And we got funded to launch a startup, which we did. But after a while, 2 of us felt it's impossible to keep up with school and the startup. So we broke it. And I got an offer from a blockchain startup here in Montreal called Catalaxy. And I joined Catalaxy as a numerical analyst to solve some mathematical problems. But fast enough, the product manager wanted to launch a tax product. And so we started it, me and him, and I was figuring out the logic, the calculations. And once I did that, we started growing the team and I started finding myself more and more as a lead the product. And I'm really glad that I had the experience over there. It really taught me a lot. And now I am at Figment, where I plan to be for as long as possible.
So this project is interesting to me because it involved blockchain and, you're obviously an ambitious student, have a lot of background in some technical fields. What was it about blockchain, either the technology or the underlying philosophy of it that drew your attention?
From a philosophical perspective, I used to think a lot about the philosophy behind blockchain. And so you could see for the last couple of thousands of years, all the greatest philosophers of all time, they all had this centralized thought process. They all believe in a central entity that gives answers to the populations and to the community and gives this kind of directives and direction for everyone. And this is true for almost thousands of years. And you could maybe try to read Machiavelli or Hobbes, political philosophers, and they all talked about this kind of an entity that has a lot of power and control of the population to make everyone's life easier. And that's why for our entire life, we always thought that the centralized thought is the right thought because all these great philosophers thought about it. But back at the time, they couldn't imagine a place where that decentralized philosophy exists because they didn't have the tools to imagine such thing happening and people communicating and achieving stuff in this decentralized way. But you could see the philosophy and science as two entities that they are intertwined and they always affect one another. And if we take an example, Copernicus and Galileo and Kepler, whom they talked about the Earth turning around the sun and not the sun turning around the Earth, and the Earth being actually a sphere. So these people, when they were talking about this kind of science, they were against everyone else around them. But then once they were able to verify their science and the formulas that they're talking about, the influence and the impact of this science on the entire population and the entire human was big. So the thought that the Earth is rotating around the sun and we are not the most important entity in the universe had influenced humans to feel more humans and connected and down to earth. And suddenly we are looking around us and feel that everything around us has maybe the same importance as us. So you could see this kind of science having direct impact at philosophy. And then this philosophy of us changing the way that we used to believe had a direct impact on our science as well, which created the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. And so what I'm saying right now, you could see that technology is in a certain way similar to science. And now we have this kind of technology that is enabling us to communicate across the globe, which is the internet and the blockchain technology. And this is directly influencing our philosophy towards decentralization, which they didn't have at the past. So is it fair to say that the centralized thought is the right thought, giving the truth that they didn't have this kind of technology thousands of years back, and now we have it? So is it good to be resisting to the decentralized thought? So my only question right now that we're trying to propagate is why decentralization, giving that technology that we have right now?
Well, that's a really interesting answer. And I want to ask a follow-up to it, which is, if our philosophy and our science kind of reflects back to us our knowledge or understanding of the world, what do you think it is about blockchain? What is it reflecting back to us? What does it say about where we're at as people?
Yeah, so this is actually a very good question to say where we're at right now. So by using this kind of blockchain technology, right now we are proving that humans can come together on a very, very large scales, and we can communicate and achieve stuff in a decentralized way. So suddenly, right now, we could see people and teams across the globe communicating together and coming together because they have a certain objective that they're working towards it. And so that shows and gives hope in the future that if people has this kind of shared objective, they can and will come together on a large scale.
What would you say to somebody who is a little bit reluctant to give up some of these traditional or conventional ideas regarding the philosophy of technology and don't want to adopt blockchain? What would you say to them? What's the benefit of pressing forward here?
Yeah, I would say that it's completely normal. So for our entire life and the generations before us, we always had followed this kind of centralized thought process. There was always a centralized entity to give us answers and to make everything clear for us. And now suddenly we are shifting towards a decentralized system. And I was once talking with my uncle, and I was many years back, and I was explaining to him Bitcoin. And he asked me a question, who is in control? And I told him no one is in control. And he told me, so it should be a scam, because if no one is in control, of course it's a scam. And the idea that no one is in control, but all of us are in control, is so strange and hard to grasp. So it's completely normal to feel friction and to feel it hard to shift from a centralized towards decentralized thought process. But as we just said right now with the example that we gave, the impact of Copernicus and Kepler science on the philosophy, it was huge. Like when they were thinking only about their science and about the formulas, they didn't have a clue about the impact it can have on the entire life around them. This kind of thought gave birth to what we call the rise of science, and that launched so many great achievements for humans. And when they were able actually to explain the skies, scientists were saying that religious doesn't know and doesn't own the skies. We own and we know more the skies than them. And that gave them power to go out and to do the unimaginable. So right now, I think it's kind of similar with the decentralized technology, where once we prove, and we are already proving that it's happening and we can achieve a lot of objective on a large scale, the impact would be unimaginable. We can't actually have a clue what the impact would be if we are able to adopt that decentralized thought process in our daily lives.
Well, Joseph, I'm going to have a lot of follow-up questions about the graph later in our interview. But before we leave this topic about philosophy and blockchain, I want to ask you then, how does the graph fit into all of this?
So the graph, from a philosophical perspective, is a form of epistemology.
How would you place Ethereum in this philosophical perspective?
Yeah, so Ethereum is a really interesting and smart blockchain. And I think that Ethereum was actually the tip of the spear that created this movement, that created this philosophy of smart contracts. And it enabled DeFi and NFTs and a lot of applications being built on top of it. I think Ethereum gave us the motivation and the hope to believe that decentralization and blockchains have a lot of utility, a lot of power, and we can really enhance and use this kind of technology. But I don't think that it stops at Ethereum. Web3, I think, is a collection of many blockchains, and I think each blockchain has something to provide. And I think Ethereum is one of the most important blockchains, and it's always going to be one of the most important blockchains. But I think it fits in the larger picture with a combination of other blockchains.
Well, Joseph, thank you for letting me ask so many follow-up questions about this philosophical perspective about blockchain that drew you into the crypto space. In the interest of time that I have with you, I'll go back to your career track here a little bit. So after you got involved in crypto, you made the move to Figment. What was it about Figment that drew you over?
Yeah, so back when I was working at the previous startup, it was actually starting to be more and more like a corporate life. And then the COVID happened and there was downsizing. So we were a team of 30 and then a lot of people had to leave. At the end, we were only a team of 7. And then when I left, there was only 3 people. And by the time I was looking at Figment from like an outside perspective, and I was seeing that they are always implicated in their communities, they are really deeply involved in protocols. And that kind of drew me. And when I was looking at them, I always felt that they were building something, they were onto something. And that was kind of attractive. So I really wanted to approach and join Figment. And then one day, one of my friends, Josh, head of finance at Figment, has called me and asked me if I'm interested in joining Figment. And it took me just a second to accept. I'm really happy about that decision. And I really like right now the culture over there. It's a place when you can grow, you have the space to run, to test ideas, and you work as much as you can. No one is setting up walls over there.
Part of the reason, Joseph, you and I are speaking today is because on July 29th, the Graph announced a new partnership with Figment. And you are the product manager with the team at Figment working on the Graph. And I really appreciate that you'd give me some time today to talk a little bit more about Figment. So maybe we should start there. What can you tell us about Figment and what it does?
I think we can take a step back and give you a bit of history on the founders. So you have Lorian and Matt, CEO and the CTO, which they have something around 30 years of building internet infrastructure. And I think they were one of the first to build the internet infrastructure here in Canada. And then after years, they start seeing that Web 2 is actually changing from what it was supposed to be. It was supposed to be this kind of internet for the people, give the freedom, more cyberspace. And then with Web 2 changing and having like more and more smaller companies taking control of this Web 2, they decided to go and start working on Web 3, where they know that philosophy behind it is kind of the philosophy of privacy and protecting your identity. And the key element behind Web 3 is actually decentralization. So they launched Figment with Andy, the third co-founder, which has this kind of same vision. And they started working on Figment. And they were actually always looking to answer the question, how could we enable Web3? How could we advance and build the infrastructure for Web3? So a lot of decisions from Figment is actually to try and to enable and to build Web3. So that's why we have built our Learn, which helps Web2 developers to shift from Web2 to Web3. And we have constructed validator infrastructures and Data Hub, which allows developers to build applications and use the blockchain data directly in a seamless way.
Well, I heard some of this commitment to Web3 mentioned in indexing hours recently when you and other members of the Figment team joined and described similar answers about the new partnership with the Graph. But I'd like to really double click on that. What is it about Web3 that drives so much of the mission and vision of the Figment team?
So everyone has a reason to love and care about Web3, and that's entirely true. Each person has something that they love about Web3. And back at our team, one of my colleagues is fascinated by data privacy, and then another one, she's really fascinated about protecting your identity. So you could see Web3 as a combinations of stuff that we don't currently have, or we currently oppose. And when you think about the idea that 3 or 4 companies are controlling 20% of the entire traffic on the internet, and they are always trying to collect data and more data and trying to estimate and try to manipulate your thoughts and your behavior, it gets scarier. And with time, we're building more advanced tools and we're collecting even more data, and that will give them even more power and more, if you want, more ideas about us. From data, you can always derive conclusions. So that with time, it's getting more and more scarier. And people that they have this kind of thought, they're finding the answers in Web3. So in Web3, we're trying to decentralize power. We're trying to decentralize governance. We're trying to decentralize freedom. No one is trying to have control over data and over your identity. And so everyone that has this kind of thought that they care about the liberty, their freedom, their identity, and they want to be in this kind of large community is actually going towards Web3.
Well, that commitment to Web3 was abundantly clear in Indexer office hours. And so any listeners that haven't heard that discussion yet should go back and listen to that recording. It was really remarkable to hear the vision and drive behind the team at Figment in their cooperation and partnership with the Graph. The team at Figment is involved in a lot of different things. You're very committed to education. You work with large institutions, and you're a validator across many networks. And so I just wanted to give you the opportunity for a minute here and tell us a little bit more about all these different things that Figment is involved with.
Yeah, so we are involved in multiple things, and one of the first thing that you mentioned being validator infrastructure. So we were always trying to launch as many proof of stake as possible. So this kind of validator infrastructure actually helped the decentralization and to launch more and more proof of stake protocols. And then the second thing that we were doing is actually Learn, which is really valuable for us and for the entire community and Web3. So Learn is actually enabling a lot of developers to move from Web2 to Web3. The way we do it is we construct this kind of Learn pathway, which is a set of free courses on our website. So developers could come and start following this course, and every time that they complete the task, they get rewarded in the native token of the following course. So by the end of the course, developers are really knowledgeable about this blockchain that they're trying to learn about, and they have a set of tokens to motivate them and push them to start building. And it's really, really amazing to see how far people that use Learn, how far they went. We know that some of them build applications, some of them build startups, and it's amazing to see like the results of such initiative. And I know that some indexers here on the Graph has used Learn to start their journey. So it's amazing to see the results of such an initiative.
The GRTIQ podcast is made possible by a generous grant from the Graph Foundation. The Graph Grants program provides support for protocol infrastructure, tooling, dApps, subgraphs, and community building efforts. Learn more at thegraph.foundation. That's thegraph.foundation.
Hi, this is GRTIQ. Each week we get to meet a new member of the Graph community and ecosystem. The goal here is to take listeners inside the Graph by telling the stories and sharing the insights of those helping to build it. Please consider supporting this project by leaving a review wherever you listen to the GRTIQ podcast or by sharing episodes on social media. And don't forget to visit grtiq.com/podcast for detailed show notes. That's grtiq.com/podcast. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for your support.
Roger that.
Well, Joseph, I think a lot of listeners will know the Figment name prior to the big announcement of the partnership, largely because Figment is a highly visible, well-recognized indexer at the Graph. And so why don't you tell us a little bit about Figment's indexer operation?
So we have two of the largest indexers on the Graph. And actually, what our strategies and what we are trying to do is to allocate to as much subgraph as possible. So, by allocating to more subgraphs, your fees gets more and more expensive. But we, as a large indexers, we don't mind to have more fees, but to try to support the Graph network and to have as many subgraphs being indexed and giving room to small indexers. And so that is not our strategy. We are not the only large indexers that we do it. I know that P2P does it, and they are doing a great job as a large indexers. So you could see by having more and more subgraphs on the Graph network, at some point we won't be able to allocate all these subgraphs, and we're gonna have to choose a finite number of subgraphs that we're gonna be allocating towards it. And I think that is something good and valuable for small indexers. And I think that this is something valuable for small indexers to have the opportunity to be able to index certain subgraphs on their own. So I think something that might happen with the future, that the more and more subgraphs we have, we might see that some indexers are getting more and more specialized around some kind of subgraphs. And I think also that the more subgraphs we have on the network, the more that the indexing rewards are going to be decentralized amongst all the indexers.
Well, I really appreciate the way you answered that question. And in fact, I think this is becoming more of a hot topic in the Graph community. It's this idea of keeping stake decentralized. And since Figment, and you mentioned P2P, are two of the largest indexers at the Graph, it's nice to hear that there's this consideration or this conscientious approach to smaller indexers. So how would you then describe that balance that you, as a large indexer, approach this question or concern about keeping stake decentralized?
Yeah, but with being large indexers comes large responsibilities. Our decisions, our strategies really has a certain weight on the entire network. So every decision that we do, we have to think how it's going to affect the entire network. So being one of the largest indexers is actually at some point really, really consuming from a point of view that you always have to think about your actions. And if at some point you make a mistake, you have to own this mistake and you have to try to rectify it as soon as possible for the entire health of the network. By comparing with small indexers, that if they have done some kind of mistakes, it won't really affect the network. But smaller indexers have less opportunity to do mistakes because they have a small capital versus large indexers. So this is where it kind of balance one to another. But I think us, Figment, and the other large indexers, we always have to think about our actions, how it's going to affect the entire network and how it's going to affect the small indexers. And I really believe that small indexers contribute a lot to the community. We have one of the most important players in our communities coming from small indexers. So by protecting and by enabling the small indexer to grow and have more space to grow, I think this should be the job of each large indexer.
Well, when you talk about the size of Figment, another fact that's really impressive, you're working with over 35 proof of stake networks like Solana, Polygon, Polkadot, Near. And so I'd be curious hearing from you a little bit about how the work you're doing at the Graph might be different than the work you're doing at some of these other networks.
Yeah, so as we run indexers on the Graph, we run validators on other networks. And so we are engaged in something around 30, 35 proof of stake network. And so what we actually do every time that we get engaged in a certain network, we really bring value to this network. So you could see that we are kind of scaling our expertise from one blockchain to another. And then you could see that we have our research team that they learned over the time about governance proposals on other chains and networks. And then when they join a new network, and sometimes someone proposed something, they could give their opinions, they could give their feedbacks, because at some point they might have seen something similar. And then when we join a new network, we create a learn pathway for this network as well. And we always receive a lot of good feedbacks on it. And also more to that, we construct also data hub nodes to build this kind of data infrastructure for these networks. So you could see that every time we are joining a new protocol, we are really trying to benefit this protocol by enabling Learn and Data Hub and this kind of infrastructure for these blockchains. We are increasing the probabilities of more applications being built on top of these networks.
I'd like to know if you remember, what your first impressions of the Graph were, or when you first became aware of it.
I actually came to know the Graph before I joined Figment. I was right now during our days, everything turns around data. Companies try to always collect data and then they try to derive conclusions from data. You have AI models, machine learning models constructed on top of this data to always try to optimize conclusions and derive conclusions from it. So I was asking myself, since data is becoming more and more very important in our lives, who is trying to collect and organize data on the blockchain side? And this is how I started searching online for this type of data blockchains, let's say. And then I came and I saw the Graph and I started reading about the Graph. And this is how I got interested by the Graph, because I knew that data is something really important and it exists. Some kind of problem around blockchain data existed. And then the Graph was trying to provide a solution for it. And so I know that they are addressing a problem in need and something that we need for Web3. And this is how I came to know about the Graph. And when I joined Figment, Lorian, the CEO, asked me if I'm interested to work on the Graph project. And I was so happy about it, felt that it all connected together. Sometimes life is just strange.
I'm always curious to hear different guests' perspective on how they might describe what the Graph does to somebody who's non-technical.
Yeah, so if I keep what I just said before, that actually the Graph concept is something that turns around data and the importance of the Graph. The Graph is actually inheriting it from the importance of data. So something that happens on the blockchain, what is actually a blockchain? So a blockchain is a block. Actually, we could say what is a block. So first, a block, it's a kind of small database that contains information. And then you would have another block constructed on top of this block that contains data, and they're all connected. So if you change one block, the other block will change. So that's how you know, and you cannot alternate data inside blocks. So blockchain is one block constructed on top of another. But let's say at some point that you wanted to access a type of data that you are interested in, and you know that this data happened 3 or 4 days ago. So what you will do is you will go back and try to look at all the blocks that they happened during this 3-4 days back ago, and you will randomly pick one block and start searching inside of this block for the data that you're looking for. And if you didn't find it, you will jump on the previous block. And you will keep jumping from one block to another until you find that data that you are interested in. So this is where the graph comes. The graph is actually coming and trying to collect this data from the blockchain and organizing them and creating an index for this data and putting it out there. So now when someone or something, application or entity needs to access this data, they can use the graph and use the index created by the graph to access rapidly and an easier way the data that they are looking for without having to jump from one block to another.
So with the perspective of somebody that works at Figment and has involvement with 35 different proof of stake networks, how then do you think the graph fits in the crypto space?
So you could see the graph is this kind of protocol that enhancing and enabling indexing blockchains, API services, data services, which is something really important in our daily lives for a lot of applications and for Web3. And you can see it as, if we take a step back and you just look at a city. Inside of city, you will need a university, you will need a hospital, you will need different entities to construct a city. So the same concept applies on Web3. So if you want to enable Web3 and construct Web3 will need different protocols that each one of them has its purpose and something to provide different than other protocols to Web3. And you will want these kind of blockchains to work together and communicate together. So you could see the graph is one important piece of the entire Web3 and that's going to communicate and work with other blockchains. And the Web3 is going to be this kind of an API indexing service, allowing applications and other protocols to access data rapidly and cheap way also.
Do you think Web3 can exist without a solution like the graph?
I doubt it. I doubt it very much.
In your opinion, how does the graph different from competitive-like solutions?
To answer this kind of question, I could tell you about DataHub, which is something that we built at Figment. And DataHub is actually, you can see that it's doing the same kind of job in a certain way as the graph. So what we're actually doing with DataHub is creating this kind of full nodes that applications could use to access data on blockchains without having to manage these nodes themselves. But the graph is doing it on Ethereum. Now, the graph is doing it in a decentralized way. And everyone here in the space that works inside the crypto, blockchain space and Web3, they are here because they believe in decentralization and they are working towards decentralization. So if you have a protocol that is giving the same kind of technology as your company is doing, but in a decentralized way, it is the way. And everyone is going to be appreciating this technology and adopting this technology because it's being done in a decentralized way. So this is the real power of the graph, to allow this indexing and API or data service in a decentralized way. I think the graph is one of the most decentralized protocols out there.
Well, the product DataHub came up during Indexer office hours, and you just mentioned it as something that's kind of similar to the graph. If you don't mind, can you just take a minute and describe a little bit in greater detail what DataHub is?
Yeah, sure. So DataHub is actually, you could see it as a product that creates full nodes on a certain blockchain. So let's say you're an application and you want to build on top of Solana, but you don't have a lot of experience managing nodes, data nodes, and having this kind of access to the blockchain data. So what we actually do is we create this kind of full node that connects to the blockchain and creates this gateway for data. And now applications, they could use DataHub to directly sync their applications in our full nodes and get the data that they want. And they won't have to worry about their full nodes. So this is kind of the idea of DataHub, similar a bit to the graph, but in a centralized way and on different networks than Ethereum.
Well, that's interesting, Joseph. Thank you for explaining that. So would it be fair to say, and again, I'm kind of a non-technical person, but would it be fair to say that Figment is in ways a competitor to the graph, at least in the past?
I wouldn't call it a competitor. I would actually call it as DataHub, Figment, and the graph complementing one another. You could see it as you going to a city where no one has ever ate a burger there, and you open a burger shop, and then I would come to the city and open another burger shop somewhere in another neighborhood. So together, you and me, we're actually bringing to the city this kind of burger culture. So we are more allies that we are enemies or competitors. So together we're working towards bringing this burger culture to the city. So you could see it back at the days. If we go a few years back, Data Hub and the Graph, we are actually bringing this idea and this possibility for applications to know that a solution to build on top of data infrastructures it exists, and they wouldn't have to worry about managing nodes and data infrastructures. So we gave, if you want, the motivations to more applications and dev to come and build on our infrastructure and enable more and more Web3. So I think we complemented each other and we created this kind of movement.
Hi, this is Joseph Alshami with Figment, and we are indexers and now a core developer team at The Graph. If my conversation with the GRTIQ podcast has been helpful to you, then please consider supporting future episodes by becoming a subscriber. Visit grtiq.com/podcast for more information. That's grtiq.com/podcast. Thanks for listening.
GRTIQ
Podcast.
So I want to turn more of our focus now to the announcement that was made on July 29th about Figment joining the Graph as a core dev team. I think it would be great to just start with a general description of what does it mean to be a core developer at the Graph?
It means that you will have to join the existing teams, which is right now Streaming Fast and EdgeNode, and we have to find ways to collaborate all of us together and works toward the shared objective that we have now, which is the Graph protocol. And so you could see that there exists multiple ways to create a protocol and to actually get to the final objective that you're looking for. And so I think Yaniv talked about it during ETH conference at Paris, and this kind of progressive decentralization that you will actually start with an infrastructure and you will deploy your infrastructure out there and people and community will start working on it. And then you can start building it more and more and more. So as you are starting with the infrastructure of a car and then building the pieces of this car. So you could see that the EdgeNode team had created this kind of infrastructure and they had a lot that they wanted to achieve, but there's a lot of stuff and they needed help. And now Figment has joined to keep this movement going and to attain the final objective. And now what Figment we are going to do is we're going to take this precious technology of the Graph and we're going to be bringing it into other blockchains. So the Graph is going to be indexing more and more blockchains. We're going to bring it to Cosmos or to Polkadot and other blockchains in a way to enable the Graph access to more blockchains.
When the Streaming Fast partnership was announced, I had the opportunity to talk to Marc-Antoine Ross on the podcast. And now with Figment partnership being announced, I get to speak with you. I think listeners would want to know from your perspective how these two different core dev teams are going to work together and contribute to the Graph.
Yeah, so I think when they talked about, when they first joined, they talked during the Indexer office hours about how they could index in a very fast way. So both of us has a lot to contribute and to give to the Graph protocol. And Streaming Fast, as their name says it, they are enabling speed and faster indexing. And we, using our previous experience, we've been doing this for the previous year. We've been indexing multiple different blockchains. So we're going to be bringing this kind of expertise to the Graph. And I think together, in a way, we're going to be enabling the Graph to index more subgraph, and we're going to try to make it faster and in a seamless way. So I'm really looking forward for the future and for our collaborations as different teams.
And I know when I interviewed Marc-Antoine Ross, he was joining me from Montreal, and that's where you're joining me. I'd like to ask a follow-up question about Montreal. I'm intrigued. What is it about Montreal that makes it so friendly to entrepreneurship, tech, and I guess in this case, crypto?
I think it all started with artificial intelligence. So here in Montreal, we have one of the best schools. We really have really good universities, and companies have access to this kind of student talent. And I think Montreal is the second most important city in the field of AI. I know that Google are trying to come to Montreal and open offices here. So this kind of AI movement created a lot of competitions and a lot of community members creating challenges and competitions. and creating this kind of fund and launching startups. So it kind of created this fintech community where you could see more and more people are joining, and we're having this startup culture. And by the time crypto was getting more interesting for people, and they were organizing talks and meetups, and they were bringing people from the space to talk about their work and explain more blockchains. And that created a lot of interest. And you see startups starting building blockchain and cryptocurrencies tools and products. And as you said, Streaming Fast is here in Montreal. So maybe I'm going to surprise visit them soon.
Well, I think you should. Before we started recording the interview and we were just kind of getting to know one another, we were talking about some of the skills and capabilities in addition to the talented people that Figment would bring to the graph. And you brought up this idea of a network graph. And I wanted to come back to that. What is a network graph and how is it different from a subgraph?
Yeah, so right now you could see that the graph is only indexing Ethereum. And all the subgraphs that we have on the graph network is actually applications being built on top of Ethereum. And so when an indexer is indexing a subgraph, they're actually using this subgraph to use the metrics defined inside the subgraph to collect and organize data from Ethereum blockchain. And now we want to do the same from other blockchains. So what we are creating this kind of new concept or entity that we call it the network graph. And you could see the network graph as an entity that it will connect indexers to new blockchains. So a subgraph is actually a derivative of a network graph. Now, let's say if we take the example of Polkadot, we create a network graph for Polkadot that will allow and give the opportunity for subgraphs being created using this network graph that actually are indexing the Polkadot blockchain. So by creating this concept of network graph, we are actually giving more and more space for indexers to start indexing other blockchains.
What would you say to listeners that are curious about how they might see this partnership actualized at the graph?
Yeah, so as I was saying, our job is we're going to be bringing the graph indexing into other blockchains. And I think this is a step forward and an important step for the graph. We are actually enabling the graph to access more and more blockchains and having more and more applications being built on top of it and has more utility for the Web3. So I think this is increasing the importance of the graph and the importance of the role of the graph in the Web3. I think the community should be happy about it to see it as a step forward.
Do you think your role at the graph as an indexer will inform the way the Figment team approaches this new role as core developer?
In some sort of ways, maybe. So as us being already indexers on the graph, we might use the philosophy of an indexer on the graph to construct our ways in the core dev team. We already have the experience running indexers, so we might be asking ourselves the questions: what would make the indexer life easier? How could we help indexers? How could we scale the indexers' operations? But you could see our indexing operation as a different team from our core dev team. So these are two complete different teams that they don't work one with another. But what I could really say is that the way we're going to be doing it from the core dev team perspective is we're going to try to keep the way that it's already been happening in this indexer community. And we're not trying to force changes. We're going to try to adopt this kind of our ideas to everyone to have the time to think about it and collect feedback about it. So our indexer operations is only influencing us to actually think about indexers while we are doing our own proposals.
Well, that's an important point you make there, and I think it's worth coming back to and just making it 100% clear. So are you saying that the indexer operation team at Figment and the core dev team at Figment are two separate teams working on different things?
Yeah, exactly. Our core dev team has zero connection with our internal indexing operations. And these are two completely different teams. And we actually have a third team that works on the graph that is actually separate also from our core dev team. So you could see our core dev team actually a part of Figment, but also a part of the graph protocol. our entire resources of the Graph Core team is actually being deployed on the Graph network. We want to think, how could we move forward? How could we take the technology that we have already built and deploy it on the Graph? We don't concern ourselves with our indexing operations. That is left for our indexing operation team.
Well, one of the first things that Figment did following the announcement of this partnership, and I'm really excited to ask you this question, and I guess it kind of goes back to a question I asked you earlier about keeping Stake decentralized and how Figment balances being a large indexer with a lot of smaller or medium-sized indexers at the Graph. And the first thing that Figment did with their partnership is they awarded some GRT to other indexers within the community. And I know that when that was announced, it caught a lot of attention on Twitter, and I was certainly impressed by it. Why was that such an important thing for you and the team at Figment to do?
Yeah, so as you said, this decision was really important for me and for the entire team. So for the last couple of months, I've been implicated in the community and I've been working alongside some community members. And that kind of inspired me to see how much these people care and how much they are giving back to the protocol. And that also inspired me, for me personally, to be giving more and more for this for the protocol. And now when we got this 5 million grant and we were asking ourselves, what are we going to be doing with it? We actually arrived to consensus very fast that we should give it back to some small indexers or some small medium indexers, that they are actually contributing a lot for the Graph. And so the vision was to say thank you for these community members and to motivate them to keep building and to keep pushing this vision further, because communities are really, really important into building protocols and network and pushing this vision forward and further. And in a certain way, we actually also wanted to decentralize our stake, and we wanted to say, let's try to give it back to the community in the most decentralized way.
You bring up the Graph community, and as I've mentioned in other times, Figment works across 35 other proof-of-stake networks, and so you all have some pretty good relationships and a good perspective of different communities in the crypto space. What makes the Graph's community different from others from your perspective?
It's all about the people inside the Graph community. You have some really smart people, some really motivated people and experience, and they know exactly what they're trying to do. And so we could go back like a month ago or something around a month ago. There was a lot of questions around query fees, and Indexer wanted to understand more and more about query fees. But query fees is like a difficult concept to grasp and to understand. And so suddenly you see a small group of indexers being formed that they took the responsibility and they took the initiative to start this kind of small group and start researching the query fees concept, and with an objective of trying to understand as much as possible and trying to create some resources. So at the end of our meetings, we always try to put our ideas into some papers. And our objective is, after a while, when we are confident and we know and understand better what we are doing, to bring that to the entire community. So now when you see this type of initiative, people and indexers forming groups to understand and to explain concepts and hard concepts to the entire community, that makes you really happy and really proud that you have these people inside of your community.
The big announcement before this partnership with Figment was the launch of the Graph's curation program. I'd like to ask you, or get your perspective on that launch. What's been your perspective of the launch and rollout of the curation at the Graph?
The curation role is really a difficult role to grasp and to understand. So to be a good curator, you would need to understand the entire Graph process and to have this kind of large scale understanding of the Graph. So if you take a step out and you look and zoom out on the Graph and you look at things from a higher perspective, we know that the Graph is a decentralized and permissionless network, and they are trying to provide this kind of indexing and API service in a decentralized way. Now, in order to be able to create this service in a decentralized way, the Graph introduced something called subgraph. And since the protocol doesn't control these subgraphs, someone had to deploy subgraphs. And now subgraph actually are being deployed by applications that need to collect data, but they don't want to manage this kind of data services. So they create a subgraph, and inside this subgraph, you have a smart contract. They define the metrics that interest them. And then they deploy the subgraph into the network, the graph network. And then indexers start indexing it and collecting this data. But now the question could be, if you had, let's say, 100 subgraph, and an indexer wanted to choose one subgraph to index, how will the indexer choose one subgraph versus another? Or in another form, how would you define the utility of a subgraph? And since we said that the entire purpose of the creation of a subgraph is to serve data, so a subgraph that serves data should be indexed more than the others. But how would we know that? So this is where the curator role comes in, and they actually are signaling GRTs into subgraph to signal the importance of the subgraph. And the more you have GRT signaled on a subgraph, the more the subgraph becomes profitable from indexing rewards perspective. So you could see that curators are actually bootstrapping subgraphs into indexing. So as a curator would come, they would signal on a subgraph, they would bootstrap the subgraph, and indexers are starting to index and create and organize this kind of data. So in short, you could see curation as a bootstrap mechanism and also as a decision tool making for indexers.
Well, that's an incredible explanation of what curation is and why it's so important. So I appreciate you walking us through that. And I know that you've written 2 guides to curation, and these are available for listeners. So I would like to encourage any listeners that have interest in learning more about being a curator at the Graph to go read these guides. They're very well done. What would you say to listeners who want to learn more about curation and download one of your guides? What are they going to find inside?
Actually, the first guide was pretty straightforward. We were actually receiving some questions about how to curate. And so I created this kind of guide with some sort of explanations about curation and how to actually curate. And then after a while, we started to realize that there was a lot of problems around the mathematical concepts of curation. People didn't have this kind of in-depth knowledge about curation. So I wrote the second article on which I called it Curation in Depth, that explains exactly what curation is, gives you this kind of explanation from a higher perspective. And we jumped into the bonding curves and how the bonding curve mechanism is integrated into the graph. And we also explained how to expect rewards and loss and what is the real role of curator. So you could see that my second article will give you a real understanding and in-depth understanding of the entire curation process.
Well, curation's new, and these guides are very helpful. So again, I want to encourage listeners that want to learn more about curation to find these 2 guides. Maybe as a final follow-up on this topic of curation, what would be your advice to people that might not be technical? Maybe they've only been participating in the Graph as a delegator and want to get involved in curation.
I would suggest that they take it easy and they take their time to learn more about the Graph network, about curation, what is the real purpose of the curation, and how to estimate rewards, how to estimate profit, how to estimate losses. Because during the last period, I collected some kind of data and I calculated the profits and loss. So you could see there's a lot of profits, but at some point there was a huge loss. So I would suggest everyone to take their time to get a feel of the entire process, to learn more, and then you actually start creating.
Well, Joseph, you've been very generous with your time. I really appreciate you joining here. And I really congratulate the team at Figment for the work they're going to do as a core dev and for all the work they've done as an indexer at the Graph. 2 final questions. The first one is this. What's your long-term vision for the Graph?
Short and sweet. I think the Graph is going to be indexing the world. The Graph everywhere.
And the second question is, if people want to learn more about you or the work that Figment is doing at the Graph, what's the best way to do it?
They can reach us on Discord and on Twitter. We are actually always available, and we will appreciate anyone reaching out. And if you look on the Graph Discord, you could see a section on the right called Figment, and you could see some members from the Figment team over there. And so don't hesitate to reach out.
This has been a production of the GRT IQ podcast. For more information, including detailed show notes, visit grtiq.com/podcast. That's grtiq.com/podcast.
Please consider contributing to this project and helping build the community by subscribing and leaving a review.
GRT